Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining for today's conversation, Artist Talk with Farideh Sakhaeifar and Regine Basha. My name is Klaudia Ofwona Draber. I am the founder of CODA. It's a social practice residency for mid-career artists. And we have had the honor and have the honor to work with Farideh Sakhaeifar to create an exhibition, You Are in the War Zone, in collaboration with Trotter and Scholler, currently on view until Saturday. Saturday is the last day, so make sure to go check out the exhibition. I am also the curator of the exhibition, and it's been a great honor to work with Farida to put this exhibition together. And I'm going to now invite Tahir Carmali, who is a wonderful, amazing artist and also CODA's board member, who will introduce the two speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. When Claudia told me that this artist talk was happening with Farideh and Regine, I jumped on the opportunity to somehow sort of introduce both of them, because I've had the honor of working with both of them, Regine Basha at Pioneer Works when she was the residency curator and director, and Farideh I have actually had the honor of showing with her twice, once at Trestle Art Space and at the Shed. So I really wanted to just, introduce both of them, as I have worked with them and really have enjoyed working with them in just so many different capacities. And here he goes. So Farideh Sakhaeifar is a Turanian-born, Brooklyn-based, multidisciplinary artist and educator. Sakhaeifar's work investigates the politics of conflict, collective history, and personal accounts. She employs a range of media to critique US foreign policy and the Western narrative of the war in the Middle East and the North African region. Regine Basha is a curator, artist collaborator, and educator based in Brooklyn. She is the producer of the audiovisual archive, Tuning Baghdad, based on her family history in Iraq. Her projects may be found on bashaprojects.com. And without further ado, let me pass it on to Regine and Farideh to take it away onto this amazing artist talk that I'm very much looking forward to.
Thank you so much, Tahir. And thank you so much to CODA, to Claudia, for your wonderful organization supporting mid-career artists and social engagement. The show is fantastic and well curated. I encourage you all to run to see it. And thank you to Farideh Sakhaeifar for inviting me to this discussion, to dialogue with you, to go through the works together. And I am honored, really, to be chosen as someone to to go through with this with you together, because I feel like I've seen your work a number of times, and first time was at Cornell when you were a student, actually. And I remember very clearly back then that I found you to be very brave and courageous. And I'm always in awe of artists who are willing to take on the difficult subjects, especially women artists. So I applaud you. The show is a 7-year survey. There's a lot of very strong work. I encourage you all to take time to see because each and every one of the works is like a universe into itself. And there's also video of your collaborative group, HEKLER, a lot to get into. So without further ado, I think one of the things I just wanted to say before we do begin is that Farideh and I will have sort of an animated discussion, in that we're going to talk through the images, the images of not every single work in the show, but a selection will be discussed here. And those of you who would like to ask questions, you can ask in the chat, as was described by Claudia. But I urge you to also ask your questions vis-a-vis the images as well, vis-a-vis the works that Farideh has made. These are through subjective experiences and personal experience, as well as a critical read of America's media industry, really, and our perception of the Middle East through that industry. And so just to say that we are not politicians here, we cannot break down or analyze, the grand narratives of the political landscape at the moment. We are dealing with very strong subjects. And of course, we will speak to your questions to the best of our ability. But I'm just urging you to also address the work that we are discussing. Thank you. And on to Farideh. Welcome. Farideh, I just wanted to, as we discussed between ourselves privately, to introduce and the fact that you have several themes, even though the broader theme of the show, You Are in the War Zone, deals with conflict and deals with war and genocide and displacement. There are many ways in which you enter these themes, in various kinds of works. As I had said, I call them entire universes. So I think maybe we'll start, as you have mentioned, with the earlier piece, something that we had seen when I had visited you. This was the piece that we discussed, Acquired from the Above by the Present Owner. So if we can start with that, and then we can go into other themes, such as how you deal with monuments and appropriated imagery through the media. Mm-hmm. Take it away.
Sure. First, I guess I'm going to repeat and thank everybody for being here. Thank you, Klaudia, Nadine, and Tahir for Coda and all your support and help and organizing this event. And also thank you, Regine, for engaging in this conversation. This is amazing. And I'm also honored to be in a conversation with you. And for everybody who joined us today, I'm seeing a lot of friends, and that's really exciting to see that you're here, and also new faces. So Acquired from the Above by the Present Owner is a piece that I kind of started the piece in 2011, 2012, and the origin or the starting point was a conversation I had with my nephew back in Iran. That he told me that there are that he's buying this army gear, US army gear, that he's been finding in these pop-up stores in downtown Tehran. So to just give you a little bit of a background, there's a neighborhood in Tehran called Gomruk that originally, I remember also when I was back in Iran, there's a place that they say you can find everything in this black market in this neighborhood. And there's an expression that say, you can find from Juna Adamizad to Shira Morg or something like that. Basically, it says, anything that you can imagine, you can find there. And I think that was a fascinating thing for me to hear, that there are these pop-up stores that are selling US Army gear that's been imported illegally from Afghanistan and Iraq to the country, and there's actually a market for that. So I started, thinking about it, and I started talking to people about this event, this thing that is happening, this trend. And because of, my limitations in mobility, I haven't been able to go back to Iran. So the project started as a collaboration with my sister, Ashraf Sakhaeifar, who I asked her to, investigate and find these people who actually purchase these gears. And I just wanted to understand why, given the fact that, for me, as somebody who was born during the Iran-Iraq war and lived through the trauma of the war, and also experienced and heard about, growing up, I heard about the Gulf War, I heard about, and I learned about US invasion in Afghanistan and Iraq, and kind of constantly living with the fear of this potential attack from the US on Iran. Because of the relationship that these two countries have had for the past 40, 50 years. I was in awe and in shock to understand, you know, why would somebody wear something that by default carries a lot of violence. I mean, not just because it belongs to the US Army, but because it's the Army gear. And it's kind of like taken that out of the context. So through these interviews and questions and, you know, conversations with these people, a lot of different nuances are unfold, which are interesting to understand and also just to observe. So at the end of the day, you know, I'm not looking at it from a judgmental point of view, but I'm looking at it from a perspective of preserving what war would bring to the region and kind of like the culture and the heritage of war, but also talking about the economy of war and also talking about the presence of the US Army in the region and how it changes the trading and the trends and, you know, all these um, nuances that it brings with itself. So every box is actually a person. And in the process of, you know, talking to these people, I was thinking about a way to present them. So I asked these people, we interviewed them, and we also photographed the collection of each person. So if you open the drawers, in the drawer, there's a collection of photographs that belong to that person. So in a way, you can understand what this person is interested in and what they buy and consume. And there's a catalog that has the format of an auction catalog. So there's like a story of that person explaining why they buy that. So there's this person who talks about sanctions and says, because of the sanctions, I don't have access to high quality gear for hiking and camping. This is affordable. So I purchased them and I consumed them. Also, he talks about the fact that US Army is the most powerful army on the planet. So wearing it, it gives him a sense of safety and security. There is this other girl who was gifted a knife from Iran-Iraq war from his uncle that still has blood on it. He kind of has been keeping it for the past years. You know, she was in her 20s when we interviewed her. And she likes the idea of taking objects out of context. And also, like, she talks about how it belongs to an army, and when I take it and I bring it to my house, it becomes something different, and I'm mixing it and matching it with my fashion and my other clothing, and it becomes a new thing that has a different meaning, but it still is kind of like carrying the meaning of it that exists within the object itself. And there are so many other stories also that, if you're interested, it's all on my website, and also in the show the catalog is in the exhibition, so you can study and read all these narratives. So I asked every person to not only share the collection with me, but also either sell. I asked them to sell one of their objects to me, but a lot of them gifted these objects to me. So after receiving those objects, they were shipped to the US. And I was interested in this idea of, you know, transitioning something that, again, is an army gear to something that is fetishized and become an object of art. And then something that you can touch, you know, placing it in a vitrine for people to view. And also, like, the drawer is half open when it's exhibited, but in my mind is like, you know, a private place that you can actually investigate and you can study another person's fraction of a life in your apartment, in your house, when you're acquiring the box. So there's a lot of, you know, kind of like flipping the meaning of what it is and what it becomes when it becomes an art object, but also what it becomes when it's taken by people in their houses. But also, you know, reflecting on the presence of war and its heritage in the neighborhood, sanctions and access to, you know, gear and material on a daily basis. So there's a lot of, you know, nuances to kind of unfold as I was studying this project.
I think this has so many kind of intersections, you know, with museological practices as well, and, you know, looting that had happened. I mean, all across both sides of the arguments, you know, the way that objects become, well, as you're very well described, how they take on these roles personally for people. I'm curious to know a little bit more about the collaborations that you had, if you could describe, you know, with one individual, for instance, if they knew what you were doing exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of explaining the project and also talk about my uncertainties from the very beginning stages. This is what I'm doing. These are the things that I'm thinking about. I don't know what direction it goes, but I'm happy to discuss it along the way. My collaboration with my sister, I'm coming from a large family and they've been always my support and assisting me in my projects throughout the years that I worked as an artist. And then all of a sudden, I find myself in exile, not having that support system.
Mm.
So in a way, for me, these collaborations are a way to keep connection with my family and work on my projects with them. But also it's about trusting them. And for example, with Ashi, she's somebody who I've been working on for many, we've been working together on many of my projects. And I also grew up seeing her and, being around her making art. So she's also a big inspiration and one of the reasons that I became an artist. So that collaboration was kind of like keeping that connection, but also it's scary in so many different levels because I'm living on another side of the world thinking about something and she's living on the other side of the world and the communication happens on the phone and I'm letting her to take on part of the project and it's about trust and it's also about letting go and kind of like getting over the ego of I'm making this thing and I don't have control on that. And what does it mean to share pieces of, or parts of the production with another person? There's a lot of learning process. There's a lot of conversation and communication that needs to happen, explanations, and also trusting their aesthetic, their kind of like approach to the topic, the way that they bring in part of their own experience and their being into the process and just like going on with the moving on with the flow and embracing that because in a sense that brings a lot of beauty in the process that maybe it's invisible in the final product but that's for me as an artist that's a lot of learning and processing and understanding things with the help of other people so yeah I guess in that sense that was my experience of the collaboration with Aisha specifically.
Well, it makes so much sense that you made a book for this project too, because as you said, so much happens in the process, and it can be unpacked in the book, which I understand is on view at the gallery as well. So if you go see the show, have a look at the book. I mean, I found it very telling how you, or I don't know if the word is telling. It's more like how you dealt with the images and the the objects in a very matter-of-fact way, and there's a kind of as if they were submitted to an auction house or something. There's a label with the progeny. It's very dry, and I find that very effective when you're dealing with highly charged, almost explosive objects in and of themselves, because there's not much you can do to make them any more incendiary. I mean, they are already objects with such heavy histories, and so delivering it in this way almost emulates the way that they get stripped of their context when they enter museums or markets or the art world and so on. So I think there's an added layer, like a meta narrative that you add to it, that I think is very smart. And yeah. Well, thank you for that. I wanted to also, so when you're in the show, that's almost, even though it's the earliest piece, is it the earliest piece? It is, right?
Almost, yeah.
Okay. So it's almost like the final piece you see, but really when you enter the show, I think we are introduced to this idea, if I may now switch to monuments as a theme. I was struck very much by, we are encountered right at the beginning with this miniature figure of a dictator, but we don't yet know who it is. It's kind of a blank-faced dictator, in the work of Topple. But then in back of that, there is this incredible large piece that reminds me very much of all the layers of discussions we've been having here in the US about monuments. And you've titled it, "When Taking Down a Statue, a Chain Works Better Than a Rope." This is 2021, and I'm wondering, how long have you been thinking about monuments in what context have you been thinking about them? Because I know there are numerous in your case. And just, the trajectory of arriving at this work, and then we can talk about Toppled afterwards. But this first, yeah.
So yeah, as you said, this is kind of a reflection on many moments that is part of my life as somebody who've been living, since the 80s up to date, but also like some images that are in my memory and in the collective memory of my generation, who lived in the Middle East and also lived in Iran. So the piece, for me, it's like images that kind of like, maybe this piece in a sense started with the other piece, Topel, that you just explained, the statue of the dictator, the faceless dictator. I had images from different topplings that happened, since 1979. I collect them, I just archive them, and I've been looking at them once in a while. And I think one of the reasons that I got interested in that, well, first of all, is the invasion of Iraq. And, I think that was a very iconic moment in my life as, again, like somebody who grew up in Iran and also experienced the war and displacement firsthand, and also experiencing in a neighbor country. So I had those images, and I like the idea of zooming in on digital images and just look at facial expressions, body languages. I think there's a lot to kind of like unpack and understand in those moments, and there's a lot of feelings. So I had some images from that time. I had images from the toppling of Shah, monuments of Shah during the 1979 revolution, images from Ukraine toppling monuments during the revolution, and also images from, and then United States happened, toppling of the monuments during specifically last summer, but also from 2015 in South Africa, which I think was one of the first moments of the toppling of the Confederate statues around the world. And then in the UK and in the United States. And that was a time for me to kind of going back in these images that I've been collecting and figure out what I'm doing with them, because I knew kind of like 6 years ago, 7 years ago, that I'm gonna make something with them that is about hand, that is about holding something, toppling something, that suspended moment that is about, there's a lot before that and there's a lot to happen after, but also that moment, the preservation of that moment that these things are happening. I feel like with the toppling of Confederate statues in the United States, this conversation became a discourse, and it was a lot easier to kind of read about them and do research on this topic. And as I was, again, I like the idea of consuming history through media in addition to other scholarly and research work that are out there, because there's a lot for me to kind of like understand in the language of the media and how things are being framed. Specifically for this piece, one of the words that really stayed with me is the word vandalism, that is used to describe this, moment of intervention in public space by the public. And I was interested, why this word is being used, thinking about monument and sculptures as something that is so stationary, and it's supposed to be a representation of history. It's supposed to be a representation of people who are actually living in that society, their past. And if collectively at some point we decide that this doesn't belong to us, or this doesn't capture our history, there are ways to intervene in that public space. And using graffitis or spray paints or posting flyers or projection on them is a way for people to kind of like intervene and um, uh, change the representation of the history. And instead of erasing that, in my mind, we have to preserve that. So the piece is kind of like the preservation of the presence of the people on the street and their intervention in the public space. Another thing that I had in mind, specifically with this piece, this is a new idea that I'm trying to understand, and that talks to the digital imagery and pixelation. My training, I was trained as a photographer, so my mind is, and I guess like you can see that in all my work, that reflection on photography. I was thinking about the promise of the photography as a medium to preserve, And that doesn't change. You know, we have negatives, we look at them, we can print them, the quality stays the same. But is digital photography actually aligned with that promise because of the pixelation and the change of the quality of the image over time? So as I was collecting these images, I realized that a lot of the details, you can't define them because the quality has lost over time. So um, thinking about it 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, are we going to be able to actually refer to these documentations as a reference to the history, or are they lost? And I guess like this paranoia or this question comes to my mind from reading this novel, which is, it's a collection of essays, Iraq plus 100, series of short stories about imagining Iraq in 100 years. And in one of the stories, they talk about, you know, they're investigating something that happened 100 years ago, but they can't really, they find like an archive of photographs, but they can't really get anything out of those images. And they make fun of us, you know, who were living 100 years before. And they're like, haha, they thought they know what they do. And they're, you know, they're preserving the stories and they're taking photographs in high quality, but actually 100 years from now, they're not even accessible. We can't read them, we can't define them. So intentionally, you know, I was thinking about enlarging these found images that I can find online to kind of like experiment with the pixel as a pigment and see if I can do, you know, digital painting with them. And what does it mean to enlarge a digital image to the point that you can define the details, and a lot is lost, but also a lot is told in those images. And a way, you know, the data, the information of these images exist in this file. So that's also, I don't know, in mind is a way to kind of like preserve them in a very visual kind of like post-production way that I don't know what it exactly means. I'm trying to, you know, kind of like study them. It's a new thing that I'm trying to kind of like unpack. But yeah, that's basically what's going on in the piece.
Fantastic. I have so many questions. Questions, comments, you know, yeah, because there's so much to say about this piece. And I hope that, yeah, we'll get to some of the people's questions in the chats later. But one of the things I was wondering as you were speaking is when you said vandalism, and then there's iconoclasm, right? And so I'm just trying to work out in my mind, like, what is the difference, or how do you know, what's closer to this? Because iconoclasm is also, there's an ideology involved, right? And a demagoguery, you know. It's both, obviously, in different ways. But I wondered if you had anything that you wanted to add to that.
I think, yeah, that's a very interesting comment. I think it's both, but maybe you know, there's the action, that the action is the iconoclast, iconoclast. I never can pronounce iconoclast. That works if we can establish that as a word.
Yes.
um, um, it's, you know, it's the action, the act of iconoclasm that is happening, but that's being commemorated to become a new monument in a way. That is the you know, the thing, the act of kind of like the act of bringing it down, the act of breaking that icon becomes an icon that is being preserved. So in a sense, it's both of them.
Yeah, that's a very important part of, I think, your work in general, is how you filled this monument, former monument, or anti-monument, I would call it, you know, with people of the streets. And I use the word anti-monument because I myself am really interested in this is a term that Gordon Matta Clark had come up with in reference to how he sliced through buildings and saw different views of the city. And it becomes about how can, you know, we civilians take over our own narratives vis-a-vis these grand political, you know, ruptures that befall upon us populations, So there's like a little bit of a pullback so that it's, yes, very specific to Iran, Iraq, but it is happening in South Africa, it's happening in the US. So, you know, it allows us to enter your subjective experience. And I think you say very aptly that you're interested in a kind of imaginative empathy. I like that term a lot. So you decidedly make work that leaves room for other people to project onto, correct?
Yeah.
And toppled, maybe this is a good time to talk about it because that it is a faceless statue. And yeah, I think very much along those lines.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think this is kind of like the beginning of what came out in 2021. And it was interesting for me to kind of reflect back on this and see how they are complementary in a sense. So this is, as you said, it's a faceless bronze sculpture of a monument, a dictator. I guess like you can just fill in the gap and put a name on it. Again, like because of, you know, the piece in a sense started in like 2012, 13, and at that time Arab Spring was happening, a lot of movements around the world that in the Arab region, and before that we had green movement in Iran, and before that, you know, the Ukraine was happening, a lot of different moments. And I started, again, that was the moment that I became interested in collecting these images, collecting images of the topplings of the monument and people intervention in the public space. Making these pieces specifically was a point of comparison for me, you know, because looking at the images, the presence of the people are actually when makes this moment a momentum, give meaning to, you know, that action. And as I was, you know, looking at this collection of images, I kept going back to Iraq and the invasion of Iraq, and kind of like reflecting on the reality that the toppling of Saddam Hussein in Ferdowsi Square in 2003 was staged, a kind of like performance by US Marines. That's toppling right. The monument, and there were very few civilians or locals actually present at that scene. And I also read this quote from one of the colonels, the colonel in charge at that time, that he said, I can quote him, you know, the exact sentences. What would that moment have been if he hadn't? It would have been some B-reel of Iraqis banging away at this thing and eventually losing interest and going home. There was a momentum, there was a feeling, this atmosphere of liberation. That was the attitude, keep the momentum going. So that was like, I think like just this quote says a lot about the intervention in that act of, you know, that collective act that creates public collective memory of an act that becomes about quote unquote liberation. And what does it mean to take that away from people and make it ours, you know? And along the way, you know, they put the American flag on it, and then they changed it to an Iraqi flag, and then that was a flag that was not a contemporary flag, so they had to change it with another, you know, there was like a lot of not understanding the politics, not understanding the society, not understanding the demand of the local, but calling it a liberation in a sense. Also, I was thinking about, you know, how this out of, you know, it's an invasion, let's acknowledge that, you know, and how that moment through media becomes the moment of liberation. You know, the curation of the narrative in Western media to make that a moment, and then the president of the US giving a speech, and then in all our collective memory, when we think about Iraq and the invasion, if the word liberation comes, we think about that moment. So, you know, thinking about these questions and trying to understand that, I think the piece came about by erasing those who do that, you know, those who kind of like perform. I leave a space to kind of fill in the gap with our collective memory and our collective imagery of how this act is happening. So in a sense, it's also about how much do we know about history to kind of like reflect on this piece.
Very good point. Yes. I mean, and that's, you know, why it's called the theater of war. You know, it is a theater, and media is, you know, whatever's good for TV and viewing audiences. And yeah. So it's, I wonder if that moment, though, because so much happened in the aftermath of Bush, in the sense that, at least in, you know, communities I was connected to, but I feel like if that moment was a, let's say, rendered somewhat even more obvious as to how much of a, you know, theatrical production the whole thing was, and the news media that you know, covered it in that way, because I feel like there was a crack that happened, in the sense that you know, people became somewhat aware of how the whole operation was really for our own purposes. And I don't know, I feel like there was a kind of tipping point, and it was in the Bush era, of the farcical treatment of that moment, taking down Saddam Hussein and all that confusion. But I don't know, as you say, you know, there's so much in service of flattening history, and of flattening kinds of, you know, creating like these intensely binary, you know, us against them narratives, that any kind of complex reading is lost, and is lost on the internet, and is lost in all our outlets. So I think another reason to say that the work that you're doing, which is really kind of bringing these pieces back together and connecting them through time and through material, and you know, through kind of like your story as you come into from Iran to the United States, but also looking back to these events. It's just so important, and you know, we don't have enough of it. So thank you for making this work. And you had this one statement actually that very much speaks to the toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue, is who gets to do what for what purpose. And that's a very powerful statement in and of itself, because we ask that all the time now, also when we are speaking on behalf of Black Lives Matter. Who gets to speak on behalf of Black Lives Matter? Who gets to speak on behalf of, you know, all kinds of communities? And it's the displaced, the refugees, you know. So it goes, you know, that's a question I think we all have to ask ourselves, is what I mean to say.
Yeah.
And be as empathetic and transparent as possible as well. Okay, so moving forward, how are we doing for time? I just want to make sure we have time for questions. I mean, would you like to go over, you know, the collage works and mute as a sort of,
Sure.
I think because we have 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to cover another major work that's in the show. One thing I was going to say, just you know, thematically as well, is that I'm very struck by how you use in your collage works. Halabja is a great example. It's sort of a wallpaper in the gallery. In your collage works, as well as in your print and photography, there's definitely an entry point for us as viewers that has to do with the absence of what's going on, the absence of the image. You use these outlines as creating these like ghost images, and then these overlays. So it's sort of the presence and absence, and how you play with that, and how it seems. I'll let you talk about this, but I can go on. But yes, please go ahead. This covers quite a lot of ground.
So the piece Halabja 1988 is just giving a bit of a context about Halabja. It's a town in Kurdish region in Iraq that was subject to chemical attack in 1988 by Saddam Hussein. During the 8 years of war between Iran and Iraq, it was one of the first wars that maybe before, you know, the use of chemical weapons in Syria, it was one of the wars that chemical weapons were used in this scale. on Iranian troops as well as on civilians. So the attack happened, in 1988, and it was an attack that, of course, was green lighted by the United States and also supported by many different Western countries. It was kind of a test to understand what is the after effect of usage of a bunch of different chemicals and gases on civilians, and literally study that. And I guess, like, who's better than a minority, and the Kurds are a minority and the subject to the attack, are the subject to the violence, so let's try it on them. As the result of this attack, 5,000 people died immediately, 7,000 to 10,000 people were died and injured over time, and they are still suffering from the after effect of the usage of these chemical weapons in the region for generations. I grew up in a way with these images. Iranian national television was dedicating a time to the anniversary of the attack and also dedicating airing time to the images of the attack. So for me, it was something that is part of my memories, it's part of my growing up, and it's shocking that that's the only thing I can, the maybe the only adjective I can use to describe it. In 2016, for whatever reason, I remembered that attack, and I was like, this is so. First of all, I realized that, aligned with the idea that how the narratives are getting lost in the United States, in the Western countries, even though, as a country, we are contributing to these, to these things that are happening on the other side. We pay taxes, we elect officials and, government. So what does it mean to kind of like erase that from our collective memory? A genocide that happened not far from our time these days. But also a genocide that was, in a sense, used to frame, kind of like to justify the invasion in 2003. So in a way, they're all interconnected. So in the process of understanding that, I dedicate a year to just collect images and study that and read personal accounts, read the scholarly work to understand, the nuances, the politics behind that. And as I was collecting images, as I said, I like the idea of zooming in the images to kind of like take in everything that I can take from a photograph that is a fraction of a larger event. So what does that one image mean? What is behind that, and what is before that, and what is after that? So as a way of digesting these images, I trace over them, and that's a way to do a censorship, because images say a lot and they are unbearable, and going to the idea of being desensitized to the images of war, because maybe one reason of that is too much of too vulgar that we can't digest them. So what does it mean for me to filter them and do a layer of censorship to be able to communicate something that by default is neglected and ignored? So tracing for me is a way of communication, and I used linocut because in the process of linocut, again, more details are lost, and also in a very metaphoric way, it's a way of establishing a narrative on top of another narrative by the act of engraving. The collages were the first step for me to understand how I can translate text into visual. I didn't know where to start. I was lost. I was like, I want to make something, but I don't know. This is a lot to capture. This is a lot to recreate and reenact, or create visuals out of them. So I used just like the magazines that I was consuming, mainly New Yorker. I took images from that from 2017 when I made those collages to kind of reflect on something that happened 30 years before. And after making the collages, the text is also, a dry one-line text that I took from personal accounts, and then I broke it down in this format to make it more look like a poetry. Again, another, adding a layer of language, or like beautifying a text in order to be able to consume it. Then I worked with, I thought about dance, I thought about reenactment. I wanted to kind of like reenact the moments after these people actually walked out of the bunker, what they saw, what they experienced, and um, what was the moment of unseeing. One of the after effects of the chemical attack was the bleeding of the eye and the loss of the vision. So in a sense, I started from seeing what happened to the moment that you don't see, you go blind. in a very, I was thinking about it in a very poetic way again, you know, seeing and unseeing of that. I thought about dance as my medium because of the use of the body, because dance, I think, inherently has is a practice that comes with the abuse of the body and torturing the body. To be trained to be a perfect dancer, you know, comes with pain. And also, you know, there's the perfection in a dancer's body that is in conversation with the after effect of the use of the chemical weapons, which is about the destruction of the body and the loss of the mobility of the body. I collaborated with Isabel Omali, and that was like hours of rehearsal in the space to understand how we can translate text into movement. And I collaborated with other people like the cinematographers, Jessica and Vesta, and also sound designer Sadra to create this video that is kind of like an experimentation to understand how that can be re-narrated. The background, I wanted to have a reference to documentary. That's why, you know, I have that background, but in a very abstract way also. And it led into creation of a monument. This is like a whole piece mute that I'm thinking of it as a monument. In the center, there is a piece that I call it a carpet. And I like to think of it as a carpet because of many reasons. The carpet is inspired by Afghan war rugs. And these are the war rugs that were made it started from 1979 after the invasion of USSR in Afghanistan. And that was a way for the locals to preserve the narrative of war in a local scale. So if you look at these rugs, there's a very accurate depiction of US Army gear and weaponry in these rugs. And also after the invasion, you know, they kept making it during the invasion and after the invasion, again, as a way to preserve their own narrative of war and displacement and invasions. So that was my main inspiration. And I'm also thinking about rug as a heritage. You know, it's craft that passed generations by generations, and usually it's very optimistic, it's utopic. And what does it mean to change the narrative of war, the vision, the visuals of the rug over time because of war and displacement? You know, how things are changing. You know, what is the heritage of war and displacement on the culture, and what is the culture of war after the invasion. So it's very abstract. The centerpiece is a collage that I use a lot of documentaries of the actual genocide with my tracings as a reference to, you know, actual documentation, and then the abstraction that happens around that. Every element on the carpet is filled in with soil, and soil for me, you know, is life, is death, it's economy, it's agriculture, it's livestock, you know, it's everything. It's your foundation, it's, you know, your being, your land. And around it I had 4 channels of video that is a different edit of the reenactment that I did with Isabel, projected on PDLC glass sheets. And the reason I chose that material is because I had the ability to play with the transparency of the sheet. So there are moments that the sheet goes transparent and there are moments that goes opaque. And when it's transparent, you lose the imagery. And that was kind of like my idea of my way of understanding what does it mean to show this piece at the Shed, a cultural institution in Hudson Yard in the middle of Manhattan, and talk about, you know, war. The monument, in a sense, so, you know, whenever the screens goes transparent, it's a reminder that you're standing in the middle of the gallery space and you're looking at the artwork, and then you're embraced by these imageries and, you know, the monument itself. I see the piece as a failure, honestly, because at the end of the day, I don't think there's any way to retell and reenact this genocide. But it's a reminder. It's a reminder, and it's a commemoration of the victims, but also a reminder to the viewer of the erasure of a narrative. So I'm seeing it as a monument in both ways: our relationship to war and imagery of war, but also, you know, the remembrance of the victims of a genocide that pretty much nobody heard about them. Yeah, I guess that's what's happening in the piece. You're mute, Regine.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much. That was incredible. I'm so glad you also, we had a chance to see how it was installed at the Shed. There are elements of it in the gallery, but seeing it sort of surrounded by the dance performance as well, I think, yeah, it makes the carpet also looks kind of like a stage, and then the whole theater of war becomes even more of a back sort of underlying narrative as well. Terrific. Well, thank you. I want to continue on and see more work, but I am afraid that we are coming to almost close to 1 o'clock, and we do have some questions that I think Klaudia will be mediating for us. So let's move on to some questions and continue our discussion all together.
There is one question from Rebecca. When I think of the war in Iraq, I think of Bush. We just got over our 4 years of Trump. I'm thinking about how Bush publicly supported Biden in 2020. Do you think the zeitgeist in America is becoming more confused about the war in the Middle East now versus Bush era? Do you think the awareness sentiment is better? Are we making progress?
Thank you, Rebecca, for the question. I think it's a bit of a politics. And as Regine also said at the beginning, I'm not a politician, but I can reflect on the question from my perspective as a person who lives in the society and I guess cares about politics and also cares about war and US foreign policy. Honestly, I don't think that we made much of a progress. I think that we are going backwards. Biden participated and voted on the invasion of Iraq. So in a sense, and also like looking at what has happened since he's been elected, I think he's more of a politician. Let's put it that way. Trump wasn't a politician necessarily; was more of a performer in the office. And Biden is, in my opinion, is more of a politician. So everything becomes beautified and becomes maybe in a sense becomes a mutual consent for the actions that maybe in my mind and maybe in the mind of people who think like me are not acceptable. So if I'm thinking about we are going to a brighter future, I have more faith on the people than I have faith on the politicians and the government, because I think if anything can happen, it's from our side, not from their side. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but yeah, that's what I think. I don't necessarily think that things are going to be better. No, I think things are going to be more adjusted, so we consume them easier and deal with them easier because of the politics and as Regine was talking, it's a theater, you know. It's about how much am I capable of selling something to you, and maybe Biden is more successful in doing that.
Yes, all I have to add to that, because she was extremely eloquent about it, and I completely agree, is that, you know, I can just add one personal note, is that, you know, growing up when you, and maybe you can share this, Farida, you know, I come from a family that came from Iraq originally, and growing up wherever we moved to, because we were displaced, we watched multiple news outlets at the same time. It wasn't just the American news outlet, you know, there was as much as you can get from different parts of the world, so you can understand and analyze how things are being presented. You know, it's a question of representation. No one admits, I mean, when you do that, you realize there's no actual truth, you know, that you're watching. You're just watching modes of display and representation and emphasis and so on. And so you become this kind of analyst of how the media is performing itself. Not to be terribly cynical about it, but it's true. On the ground, through small communities, the conversation between communities on the ground is very different, and that is where the future generates itself. But you know, whether they are given power to do anything is a question as well. But yeah. Anyway. Next question.
Sorry, adding to that, it's also about how media is as Noam Chomsky puts it, is manufacturing consent for us to understand and accept what is happening in the politics. So media is also hand in hand with the government. And as Regine said, yeah, that's a common thing. I don't rely on just New York Times or CNN or BBC. It's just like all of them. If I can also read the news from the country itself, or assume that, I think putting it all together, that's where you can get like a bigger picture of what's happening.
Exactly.
Next question is from Elana. I'm thinking about audiences. We, meaning the left and the artists community, were fully aware of the hypocrisies when they were occurring. The theater of the toppling of the Saddam Hussein monument and the true motivations for the invasion of Iraq, for instance. How do you understand that when you present this work to that same audience? What audience are you hoping to reach?
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to understand. Are you differentiating the leftist audience from more conservative audience? Is that what's happening in the question? Um, I'm trying to understand the question and understand the meanings of the words in that, but um, there are many other artists, there are many activists who've been working on this topic since the invasion and before the invasion. There was a huge protest or huge protests happening around the world before the invasion by so many different, organizers and so many different participants. Millions of people joined these protests. And there are so many artists who are working on these topics. Dina Al-Adib has like a whole series of videos on taste of displacement, the war, the monument, all of that. There are so many artists. Luma Jassim from Iraq, she's working on that topic as well, sharing her experience more as somebody who experienced the invasion and then living here as a refugee, and the experience of a refugee in the United States. When I'm thinking about making work, I'm not really categorizing my audience. I'm referring to these narratives because I think by default there's an absence of representation of these narratives in our art, in our culture, in our politics, in our education. As somebody who teaches both young adults and in the college, we don't have that narrative. We don't see the history of Iraq, Afghanistan in our storybooks. This is a contemporary war that happened when we were alive. Somebody who is in their 20s, 30s, they experienced that. And erasure of that is equal to, not acknowledging that. So I'm thinking that by making work, I'm kind of like maybe shifting the gaze a little bit and giving it a perspective to include narratives that's been neglected and ignored for decades. And my audience is everybody who is, anyone who is actually interested in that topic and cares about that politics and representation, because yes, even if you're standing on the left, are we actually on a daily basis engaged in anti-war movement and activism and organizing? Or is it, what is our relationship to war on a daily basis? And does it mean that because I think this way, I can separate myself from paying taxes that translate into bombs and gas tears and, that is dropped on people? Because that is still happening, but I'm also making the work. So I don't know if I have an answer to that question, but it's more of a, I guess, like my observations and understanding of where I am in relation to this and what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Well, and if I may add, it's also, I think, the hope is also that the art world and the purveyors of, showing your work, curators, venues, different parts of the world will take the responsibility to show the work in different places to different audiences. You're not necessarily the disseminator only. There's a whole network that is accountable when they show the work. So I think that's part of putting it into circulation, through the art world. And the hope is, yes, there's mostly in New York, in this place, people going to see art, mostly left perhaps, but it's an international question and artists. And I think, I'm hoping that it can reach other audiences as well, and spread to locations in the middle of the country, or, where new audiences can also engage with it. Thank you, Alana.
Thank you very much. We will be ending right now. Thank you very much to everybody who stayed a little bit longer with us. And thank you, Regine and Farideh, for such an insightful and wonderful conversation about Farideh's very powerful and important work. The exhibition is up until April 17th at Trotter and Scholler. Make sure to see it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Regine.
Everybody, be well.